Some men measure their worth by what they build. Other men measure it by what they can quietly take away from someone who never appreciated it in the first place. I'm Walter Hendricks, 68 years old, retired structural engineer, and for 19 years I paid the mortgage on a life I was never invited to actually live. Then my daughter sent me a voicemail asking me to skip her son's wedding, and that's when I stopped being generous and started being exact. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early April, the kind of gray Ohio day where the sky can't decide if it wants to rain. I was in my workshop behind the house on Maple Crest Drive, Columbus, Ohio, born and raised, sanding down a cedar chest I'd been building for my granddaughter's hope chest, something to hold linens and photographs and whatever a young woman starts collecting when she's 23 and about to become somebody's wife. My phone buzzed on the workbench next to a jar of wood screws. I figured it was my daughter Melissa confirming what time I'd be picking up her mother-in-law from the airport for the wedding. I wiped the sawdust off my hands and answered. It wasn't a phone call. It was a voicemail she'd left because she didn't have the nerve to say it to my face live. Dad, I need you to hear this and not make it a whole thing. Richard's family is very particular about the guest list optics, and his mother thinks it would be less complicated if you weren't at the ceremony itself. You could still come to the reception, maybe, if things go smoothly. I just don't want any tension on Sophie's big day. I hope you understand. I listened to it once, then I set the phone down on the workbench, screen dark, and picked the sandpaper back up. Not because it didn't cut me, it cut clean through, the way only your own child's voice can cut you, soft and apologetic and devastating all at once. But I'd had 19 years of practice absorbing things like this without flinching. I wasn't going to fall apart over 4 minutes of recorded audio, not yet. Hey there, family. Welcome back if you've been here before, and welcome in if this is your first time sitting with me a while. Go on and hit that little thumbs up, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight, because I read every single one of them, and I promise you, this story is going to take you somewhere you don't expect. Now, let me back you up 19 years, because you can't understand what I did without understanding what I swallowed first. 19 years ago, my daughter Melissa was 26, working as a paralegal downtown, when she came home one Sunday glowing in a way I hadn't seen since she was a little girl on Christmas morning. Dad, I met someone. His name is Richard Ashford, and I think, Dad, I think this is it. I told her I was happy for her, and I was. What I didn't know then was that across the city, in a gated community out in Dublin, Ohio, with a circular driveway and topiary shrubs cut into perfect spheres, Richard's mother, Diane Ashford, was hearing the same news and filing it away under a very different heading. Melissa told me later that Diane's first question wasn't when do we get to meet her. It was, what does her father do? When Diane found out I was an engineer who'd spent 31 years designing bridge supports and parking structures instead of, say, owning a firm or sitting on some hospital board, she treated the information the way you'd treat a stain on a tablecloth, noted, filed, never mentioned directly, but never forgotten either. Every family gathering after that became a slow, elegant performance of exactly how much better the Ashfords were than the Hendricks family. Diane would sit at the head of her dining table. The one she liked to mention was hand-carved in Tuscany, and hold court. Richard's law school classmate just made junior partner, can you imagine, at 31. Or her personal favorite, aimed right at me with a smile so warm you'd almost miss the knife in it, an engineer. How practical. Somebody has to keep the building standing, I suppose. Her husband Gerald was softer about it, the way some men are softer about cruelty, which just means they let their wives do the talking. He'd nod along and add things like, we just want Richard to have the kind of life he's accustomed to, as if my daughter, and by extension me, were some obstacle standing between Richard and the life he deserved. I used to drive home from those dinners in my old Ford pickup, windows cracked, 315 humming under the tires, and I'd talk out loud to my late wife Carol in the passenger seat like she could still hear me. Carol, that woman folds her arrogance into her napkins along with the silverware. I could almost hear her laugh back at me. But here's what nobody understood about why I kept showing up, kept smiling, kept passing the roles. It wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Melissa had already given up enough of herself in that marriage without me forcing her to choose between her husband's family and her own father at every holiday. That would have broken something I wasn't willing to risk breaking. So I stayed quiet. I smiled. I kept building. 4 years ago, Melissa and Richard bought a house out in Powell, a good school district, a two-story brick colonial that needed work but had bones. They'd stretched themselves thin to afford it, and when the roof started leaking and the foundation showed hairline cracks and the electrical panel was original to a house built in 1974, Melissa mentioned it to me casually one Sunday. The way she mentioned everything that was actually eating at her sideways, almost apologetic. "It's just a lot right now, Dad. Richard's salary covers the mortgage, but everything else keeps piling up." She wasn't asking for money. Melissa never asked directly. She was too proud, and I think some part of her still remembered what it cost to ask Diane Ashford for anything and be reminded of it for the rest of her life. I didn't make a speech about it. I called my financial guy Monday morning and started moving money. $86,000 over 16 months. New roof, electrical panel brought up to code, foundation work. A finished basement I built out myself on weekends because I still had 2 working hands and 31 years of knowing exactly how a house should be put together. I did it because I'd watched my daughter shrink a little every time she sat across from Diane Ashford and felt like she wasn't enough, and I was not going to let her go to that woman with her hand out. As long as I had money and knew how to swing a hammer, my daughter was never going to owe the Ashfords a single favor. That was my line, and I never crossed it, and I never told anyone I'd drawn it. The final piece, an $11,000 landscaping and driveway repaving job, was scheduled to be completed the week before Sophie's wedding. My granddaughter, Melissa's daughter, 23 years old, marrying a good young man named Jason in 3 weeks. I'd helped pay for half the wedding too, quietly, through a check I wrote directly to the venue so nobody would have to thank me out loud at a family dinner. I stood in my workshop a long time that Tuesday evening, hand resting flat on the cedar chest, phone dark on the bench, 68 years old. Buried my wife 6 years ago. Built things with these hands my whole working life. And my own daughter couldn't find a way to keep me in the room for my granddaughter's wedding ceremony. I picked the phone back up, opened a text to Melissa, and typed 6 words. Understood. I won't cause trouble. I hit send. Then I called Dennis Whitfield, my financial advisor of 18 years, a careful, no-nonsense man out of Grandview Heights. "Dennis, that landscaping payment for Powell, hold it. Don't release it. Pause on the line. Everything all right, Walter?" "Not yet," I said, "but it's going to be." I hung up, walked back to the workbench, picked up the sandpaper, and for the first time in 19 years, I stopped building things for people who wouldn't save me a seat. By Thursday, 2 days later, the landscaping crew never showed. The half-torn-up front yard sat there, exposed dirt, a stack of unlaid pavers, a rented excavator idling uselessly at the curb until the rental company came to collect it. The call that told me everything I needed to know about my son-in-law's family came in at 6:52 the next morning before I'd even finished my coffee. "Dad, what is going on?" Melissa's voice, tight, already halfway to panic. "Good morning to you too," I said, leaning against my kitchen counter. "I'm guessing the crew didn't show. They said the payment stopped." "Dad, the wedding is in 17 days. The driveway is torn up. There are photos scheduled in that yard. I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, keeping my voice level, almost gentle. I was told I wasn't welcome at the ceremony, so I assumed my checkbook wasn't especially welcome either. Silence on the line, the kind where you can hear someone's whole plan rearranging itself in real time. I hung up before she could answer. First time in 19 years I'd ever hung up on my daughter. I felt something close to relief, and it scared me a little, how good it felt. If you think stopping a landscaping payment was the worst thing that happened to that family in the next 3 weeks, stay with me, because that driveway was just the first domino, and once it fell, an entire structure Diane Ashford had spent 2 decades constructing started coming down with it. I made myself coffee the next morning and sat at the kitchen table. Carol and I had shared for 34 years, watching the sun come up over the maple trees in the backyard, and I waited, because I knew Richard would come before Melissa did. Men like Richard need somewhere to put their panic, and mine had always been the safest place to put it. It took 36 hours. A Thursday evening, a hard knock at the door, not the bell, the knock of a man who'd rehearsed the whole drive over and forgot every word of it the second I opened the door. Richard stood on my porch in a golf polo, jaw tight, car still running in the driveway behind him. Walter. He said my name like it cost him something. What is going on? There are guys calling Melissa saying the job's canceled, the yard's a disaster, we've got a rehearsal dinner walkthrough in 2 weeks. I stepped back and told him to come in. He said he didn't need to come in, he just needed an answer. I said it again, quieter. Come inside, Richard. He came in. I poured him coffee without asking if he wanted it, and set it down across the table, and I sat across from him with both hands around my own mug and really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. You had your mother leave a message for Melissa to pass along, I said, telling me I wasn't welcome at Sophie's ceremony. Is that true, or isn't it? He shifted in his chair. Walter, that was my mother being. Yes or no, Richard? Long pause. Yes, he said finally. Quiet. Okay, I said, and nodded. Then I think you understand why I made the call I made. No, honestly, I don't, he said. That's 11 grand sitting between us and a finished driveway 3 weeks before the wedding, and you're what, making a point? I leaned forward. I'm not making a point. I'm drawing a line. A point is something you argue. A line is something you enforce, once you finally respect yourself enough to do it. He didn't have an answer for that. I let it sit. I spent close to $100,000 on that house, I told him, not because you asked, but because I watched my daughter shrink every time she sat at your mother's table and felt like she wasn't enough for this family. And I decided, as long as I had money, she was never going to have to go to your parents with her hand out. That was a promise I made to myself, not to you. He worked his jaw the way men do when they're trying not to say something true out loud. Dad, but if I'm not welcome enough to stand at my own granddaughter's wedding, I said, then I'm no longer responsible for financing the life the rest of you are building around me. That's not spite, son. That's just arithmetic. He left 20 minutes later, engine still warm in the driveway. I watched his taillights disappear down Maple Crest and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, like myself. Now here's where it turns. And I need you to pay attention, because this is where the whole illusion starts coming apart at the seams. Richard went home and told Melissa everything, and Melissa did exactly what I expected. She called her mother-in-law. Melissa told me later, almost word for word, how it went. Diane, pacing her kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear. Walter froze the driveway money. We need someone to cover it before the photographers see a construction site. Diane's answer, delivered in that smooth, practiced voice she used whenever she wanted the room to believe everything was handled. Don't worry, sweetheart, I'll speak to Gerald. 4 words that have quietly bankrupted more families than any recession in history. Gerald called Richard himself the next morning. Don't stress about it, son. I'll make a few calls. This is nothing. Big, easy confidence, like the cavalry had already saddled up. Richard actually relaxed. That relief lasted about 2 days. Gerald promised the money by Monday. Monday came and went, with a text about a wire transfer delay. By Tuesday, his phone went straight to voicemail. Wednesday morning, Richard drove out to Dublin to sit across from his father in that formal living room with the leather furniture and the framed photos from the country club golf outing, and asked him straight out, do you have the money or not? And Gerald Ashford, the man who'd spent 19 years making my daughter feel like a guest in her own marriage, looked across that hand-carved Tuscan table and said, it's a little complicated right now. Richard, complicated. Richard started pulling threads after that, and in a town where everybody knows everybody's business eventually, once you tug one loose string, the whole coat comes apart. Because I'd mentioned to Dennis that I might need to formally reassess my financial involvement in the Powell property, I'd co-signed part of the original loan, something Melissa never wanted to make a big deal of. Richard had to start looking into paperwork, which sent him down into the county property records looking for anything that might affect his own standing. What he found there knocked the wind clean out of him. The Ashford house in Dublin, the crown jewel Diane loved to photograph for her holiday cards, had been refinanced twice in 5 years. Nearly all the equity was gone. He remembered a strange voicemail from a debt collector a few months back that he'd assumed was a wrong number. It wasn't. He called a buddy who worked at the country club pro shop, and after some hesitation, his friend admitted Gerald's membership had been quietly suspended for non-payment nearly a year earlier. The Cadillac Escalade in the driveway was leased under a business account currently flagged for repossession. Gerald and Diane Ashford weren't wealthy. They were a performance, and the curtain was coming down whether they liked it or not. Richard called me that night, close to 11. Walter. His voice was different, hollow. A man who'd just walked through a door he couldn't walk back through. Why didn't you ever say anything? Say what? I asked. That all of it was fake. I was quiet a moment. Because it wasn't mine to say, I told him. A man doesn't burn down his son-in-law's family to prove he was right, even when he's right. He was quiet a long time, breathing on the other end of the line. 19 years. Walter. I know. He made Melissa feel like every dinner, every holiday, every single time she tried. He stopped himself, started again. And the whole time he was... Yeah, I said, soft. The whole time, long pause. What do I do now? He asked. And that question, right there, was the most grown I'd ever heard my son-in-law sound in 19 years. Nothing tonight, I told him. Get some sleep. We'll sort the rest out together. Meanwhile, I'd had my own conversation with Dennis Whitfield. Walter, when you helped with that down payment years back, you didn't just gift the funds, you structured it as a secured private loan against the property, remember, for tax purposes. That means you have documented financial standing in that house. If things keep deteriorating, you have grounds to formally call the note and force a review of the asset. I sat with that a long moment. I didn't want to force anyone out of their home. Sophie had grown up in that house. But I also wasn't going to remain quietly, invisibly tied to a family that had decided I wasn't fit to stand in the room for my own granddaughter's wedding. Draft the notice, I said. Don't file it. Just send a copy to Richard and Melissa so they understand I'm serious. Are you certain about this, Walter? Dennis asked. Dennis, I've been certain about very few things in my life. This is one of them. When Melissa received that preliminary notice that her own father, the quiet retired engineer out on Maple Crest, had documented legal standing tied to the note on their house, the panic that followed was, I'm told, something close to biblical. Melissa called Richard at work in tears. Richard called Dennis's office and was politely informed that Mr. Whitfield represented Walter Hendricks and couldn't discuss the matter with him directly. Melissa called Diane, who called Gerald, who apparently threw a golf trophy across that formal living room hard enough to crack the drywall. I heard about that secondhand. I won't pretend it didn't put a small, private smile on my face. Neighbors in Dublin were already talking. A torn-up driveway and an idle excavator sitting at the curb for a week isn't subtle in a neighborhood like that. People notice. People talk, especially in a small enough world where everybody's kids go to the same schools. The image Diane and Gerald Ashford had spent 2 decades polishing the successful patriarch, the generous in-laws, the family with real money was coming apart in public, one unanswered question at a time. That's when Sophie showed up at my door. Not Melissa, not Richard. Sophie, 23 years old, drove herself over in the little Honda I'd taught her to parallel park in 6 years earlier. Stood on my porch on a Wednesday afternoon in a sweatshirt from her college, my late wife's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. Grandpa. She looked at me steady. I talked to the landscaper, Mr. Okafor. He told me you'd already paid almost everything on the whole yard before you froze it. I stepped aside and told her to come in. She didn't need asking twice. I set a glass of lemonade in front of her, sat down across from her at Carol's table, and pulled out a folder I'd kept in the kitchen drawer since the day I froze the payment. Receipts, invoices, wire confirmations, the wedding venue check, all of it. 86,000 and change on the house, another 11 on the yard, itemized down to the dollar. Sophie went through every page slowly, the way I'd taught her to read blueprints when she was 12. When she looked up, her eyes were wet, though she didn't let them fall. They told me you abandoned us, she said. I know, I said. That's not what this says. She tapped the folder. No, I agreed. It's not. Why'd you stop then? She asked. I looked at my granddaughter, the same girl I used to take fishing off the dock at Alum Creek, and I told her the truth. Because there's a difference, I said, between loving your family and letting your family treat you like you're invisible. She nodded slowly. Then she picked up her lemonade, leaned back, and said, quiet, matter of fact, Grandpa, I never once thought you were invisible. And just like that, 68 years old, widower, retired engineer, I had to work hard to keep my own eyes dry in front of my granddaughter. If this is landing for you, go ahead and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed because we've still got a ways to go. The driveway didn't get finished, the wedding budget didn't get restored, and the money didn't end up where anybody expected. But the most permanent thing I did in those 3 weeks wasn't financial and it wasn't legal. It was something quieter than both. There's a moment in a man's life when he stops reacting to what's been done to him and starts deciding calmly what happens next. Not out of anger, out of clarity. I reached that moment on a Sunday morning, 10 days before the wedding, sitting at Carol's kitchen table with cold coffee and a legal pad covered in numbers. $97,000, all told. 19 years. One voicemail. I picked up a pen and started writing. Dennis came by the house at 9 sharp that Sunday, wearing the same style of navy blazer he'd worn to our meetings for the better part of 2 decades, carrying a briefcase that had seen more family unraveling than most therapists. "Before we start," he said, spreading papers across my table, "I want to be sure you've thought this all the way through, Walter, because what you're describing is permanent." "Dennis," I said, "I've been thinking this through for 19 years. I'm only now writing it down." He almost smiled. "All right then. Let's build it properly. Here's something most people get wrong about quiet men. They assume quiet means passive. They assume that because a man doesn't raise his voice, he isn't calculating anything at all. Gerald and Diane Ashford made that mistake for 19 years, and it turned out to be the most expensive assumption of their lives. While Richard and Melissa scrambled to find $11,000 for a landscaping crew, while Gerald made calls that led nowhere and offered explanations that convinced no one, while Diane called her son twice a day about the state of the front yard and the neighbors slowing their cars to look, I sat with Dennis restructuring every financial thread I had left tangled in that family. First order of business, formally releasing my documented interest in the Powell house. Dennis sent the notice, and it did exactly what it was built to do. Richard, with no help coming from his own parents, had to go to a local credit union and refinance the entire mortgage in his and Melissa's names alone to buy out my position. It cost him a rough rate in this market, a monthly payment that made him wince when he told me about it later, but it cut my name and my liability out of that house completely. The day the refinance closed, I walked out of the credit union into a cold, bright April afternoon and felt 19 years lift clean off my shoulders, like scaffolding coming down once the real work underneath is finally solid. Second order of business, the one that actually mattered. The 86,000 I'd already put into that house, gone, spent, a gift I never wanted back. But the 11,000 still sitting in an account, the driveway money that never went out the door, that money had a new destination. Sophie turned 23 that spring. 3 weeks before her wedding, and 1 week before the ceremony, she received a certified letter at her apartment, addressed to her directly, not to Melissa, not to Richard, to Sophie. Inside was paperwork from Dennis's office, finalizing a legally protected fund in her name, seated with that same $11,000, the exact figure Gerald had loudly promised to cover as his own wedding gift before his accounts started unraveling. I hadn't just saved the money. I'd redirected the Ashfords' own broken promise straight into something they could never touch or take credit for. Alongside the paperwork was a handwritten note from me. 1 page, blue ink, in the same blocky engineer's print Sophie always teased, looked like it belonged on a construction drawing. "Sophie, a driveway can be repaved, but character can't be poured from a truck. I hope this helps you build a foundation of your own, the kind nobody can refinance out from under you. Every dollar here was earned honestly and is yours completely, no conditions, no strings, nobody else's name on it. Build the life you and Jason actually want, not the one anyone else needs you to perform. All my love, Grandpa Walter." Melissa called me 20 minutes after Sophie showed her the letter. "Dad." Her voice cracked on the one syllable, and I could hear 19 years of things neither of us had ever said, sitting right behind it. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," I said. "That was supposed to be for the I know what it was for, Melissa." Silence. "Why?" she asked. Simple. No performance in it at all. Because your daughter deserves to start her marriage without owing anyone anything, I said. That's a feeling I should have given you a long time ago. I'm giving it to her now. She didn't answer right away. I heard her exhale, long and slow, like a woman finally setting down something she'd been carrying for years without realizing how heavy it had gotten. I'm sorry, Dad, she said finally. For the voicemail, for letting it get this far. For 19 years of letting it get this far. I let those words sit in the air a moment, let them mean what they meant. Come by Sunday, I said. I'll do the ribs, the way your mother liked them. We'll sit out back like we used to. Yeah, she said quietly. I'd like that. Now, I know what you came here for, and I don't blame you. You want to know what happened to Gerald and Diane. So did I, if I'm honest. Stick with me. The preliminary notice Dennis had prepared did most of its work before I ever needed to file anything publicly, because word moves fast in a town like ours. A father formally reassessing his financial ties to a property isn't a whisper, it's a siren. And once Gerald's name got tangled up in that story, the rest of it, the torn-up driveway, the vanished landscaping crew, the frozen accounts became the kind of thing people quietly discussed over coffee at the diner on High Street and in the parking lot after church. But the real unraveling didn't happen out in the neighborhood. It happened at their own kitchen table. Richard brought home the county records and the details about the club's suspension one evening and laid them out in front of Melissa and, eventually, in front of Diane herself, who'd come by to help with wedding logistics and instead sat frozen, reading page after page in silence. She looked at the refinance dates, the collection notices, the truth of what her husband had been running just to keep the lights on in that big house with the topiary shrubs. He told me we came from real money, Diane said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He told me that our whole marriage. Richard didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He looked down on my father-in-law, she said, and her voice tightened on that last word. He looked down on Walter. For what, exactly? For being honest about what he actually had? Diane called me herself 3 days later. I'll admit, I didn't see that coming. For 19 years, she and I had maintained a cold, careful distance, the kind two people keep when neither wants to be the one who breaks first. This call was different. No performance in her voice at all. Walter, she said, I owe you an apology, and I mean a real one, not the kind I'm used to giving. Go ahead, I told her. I pushed for you to be left off that guest list because I thought it would embarrass Gerald less if there wasn't a contrast standing right there in the room, she said. I didn't know about the debt. I didn't know any of it. But that's not really an excuse, because I knew how Gerald treated you and Melissa at our table all those years, and I let it happen because it was easier than admitting what we actually were. I'm sorry. I was quiet a moment. My Carol used to say the strongest thing a person can do is apologize without leaving themselves an exit. I appreciate that, Diane, I said. And for what it's worth, I never once blamed you for staying quiet. Maybe you should have, she said softly. Maybe, I said. But I didn't. Gerald called me exactly once in 19 years. One time did that man dial my number and speak to me without an audience watching. It was a Thursday evening, 10 days after the wedding, and I was out in the workshop finishing up the cedar chest, the one I'd started building the night the voicemail first came through. My phone lit up, unknown number, but I recognized the Dublin area code. I picked up, Walter. His voice was different on the phone, smaller somehow, like a building that looks impressive from the road and hollow once you're standing inside it. I think we should talk, man to man. Man to man, I said. 19 years in, and suddenly we're men. We're talking now, Gerald. Silence, like he hadn't expected that to be so easy. Look, things got complicated with the money, he said. I want you to know none of that was ever meant to touch Richard and Melissa. Gerald, I said, setting down the sandpaper. Let me stop you right there. He stopped. I don't need the explanation, I told him. I'm not angry with you. I want to be clear about that. I'm not angry. I'm just finished. Finished pretending I couldn't see what I saw. Finished funding a story where you're the patriarch and I'm the help. Finished being welcome at your table only when it was financially convenient and unwelcome the moment it wasn't. I paused. I'm retired, Gerald. From engineering. From all of it, actually. Long silence on the line. And when he spoke again, the big confident voice was just gone. What was left was quieter than I'd ever heard from him. I suppose I owe you more than money, he said slowly. You don't owe me a thing, I told him, and I meant every word. Just leave my daughter and granddaughter in peace. Let them stand up straight for once. That's all I ever wanted from any of this. He hung up. I set the phone down, picked the sandpaper back up, and finished the chest. The real celebration, the one that actually mattered, happened on a warm Saturday evening in late May, 6 weeks after the wedding, out in my own backyard on Maple Crest. Sophie and Jason had asked to do a small second gathering, just family, since the actual ceremony had been so tense and strange. No country club lawn, no string quartet, no seating chart designed to keep certain people at a careful distance. Just my backyard, cafe lights strung between the maple trees, a cooler of drinks, ribs on the smoker, and a sheet cake from the bakery on High Street that Carol and I used to order Melissa's birthday cakes from back when she was small. Richard showed up early and helped me set up the folding tables without either of us saying much. We didn't need to. There's a particular kind of quiet between two men who've repaired something. Not perfect, not without scars, but repaired, and it feels entirely different from the silence of two people avoiding each other. It feels like relief. Melissa brought flowers cut from her own garden and arranged them in mason jars down the table without being asked, the way her mother used to. She caught my eye once across the yard and gave me a small nod. I nodded back. Sophie arrived with Jason and a couple of friends from work, loud and easy in the way young married people are supposed to be. When she came through the side gate and saw the lights strung in the trees, her grandfather at the smoker in an old flannel shirt with tongs in hand and absolutely no apology in his posture, she stopped for a second, just taking it in. Then she crossed the yard and hugged me the way you hug someone you were genuinely afraid of losing. Thanks for never giving up on us, Grandpa, she said into my shoulder. 68 years old, and I held on a little longer than I probably should have. Wasn't ever an option, I told her. Now go eat. You're making me sentimental, in front of company. She laughed, big and real, and went to find her friends. Meanwhile, across town, Gerald and Diane were sitting in a house that had already gone quiet in a different, permanent way. The Escalade was back on the dealership lot, picked up on an ordinary weekday morning with nobody watching. The foreclosure paperwork had already started moving through the county, slow and certain as a river finding its level. I didn't have to lift a single finger to bring that man's whole life down around him. 19 years of borrowed appearances did that on their own. All I ever did was stop propping up the mirror. Nobody tells you the truth about revenge, the kind that actually holds. It doesn't feel like fire. It feels like a warm evening in your own backyard with the lights strung up in the trees, your granddaughter laughing with her friends, your daughter arranging flowers in old mason jars, your son-in-law sitting in a lawn chair looking more at ease than you've seen him in 19 years. It feels like finally understanding the difference between what you built with your own hands and what you only ever funded to keep the peace. Gerald Ashford spent 2 decades funding an illusion. I spent 34 years building an actual family. And on that Saturday evening, watching Sophie laugh under those string lights with a plate of ribs in her hand, Richard walked over to where I stood by the smoker, looked at the coals, a long moment, then looked at me. I went back and read that whole text chain from before the wedding, he said, voice thick. I don't even recognize the man who let that happen. I'm sorry, Walter, for all of it, for as long as I let it go on. I reached out and, for the first time in 19 years, my son-in-law hugged me like he finally understood exactly who I was. And standing there in the smoke and the string lights, watching my family actually be a family for the first time and longer than I wanted to admit, I finally understood something Carol used to tell me back when she was still around to say it. The only real inheritance a man leaves behind isn't a house or a bank account or even a name on a deed. It's the truth of who he was when it would have been so much easier to stay quiet, keep writing checks, and call being used the same thing as being loved. I'm Walter Hendricks, 68 years old, retired engineer, and I built something Gerald Ashford never once managed to, something that's actually still standing. If this one meant something to you, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me down in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I'll see you on the next one.